I could hear the steady ticking of the clock on the kitchen wall as I stirred sugar into my coffee. It was morning, and the house had that quiet, early calm where nothing demanded urgency. My son Daniel was still asleep upstairs, or at least I assumed he was. His footsteps weren't yet echoing across the hardwood floor, nor had he come down groggily asking for breakfast. This silence had become part of our life over the past few years, just the two of us, navigating this strange dynamic of being mother and son while simultaneously learning to live with the absence of his father. My husband and I had divorced 3 years ago, the result of years of emotional distance that neither of us could bridge. It wasn't a dramatic ending. There were no shouting matches, no slamming of doors, just a slow fading of connection until the day we both realized we couldn't pretend anymore. Daniel had taken it as well as any 14-year-old could. He buried himself in his friends and school, and I buried myself in my work as a urologist. We both healed in our own ways, quietly, steadily. Now he was 17, and in a month he'd be 18, an adult. The thought made me proud and nervous in equal measure. He wasn't my little boy anymore. His shoulders were broad, his voice deep, and his life was slowly branching out into territories where I couldn't always guide him. Most notably, there was the matter of his first serious relationship. A girl named Emily. I first heard her name about 4 months ago when he casually mentioned that he wouldn't be home for dinner because he was going to hang out with Emily. It had been a throwaway comment, the kind that boys his age make without realizing how significant it is to their mothers. I remember pausing mid-step, the weight of that name settling over me. A girl. It wasn't a surprise, but hearing it out loud still hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for. From that moment on, Emily became a regular presence in our lives. I'd see her name pop up on his phone screen during dinner or hear her laughter in the background during his late-night calls. He never officially introduced her, but I saw glimpses of her. A pair of shoes by the door, her jacket draped over a chair, the lingering scent of floral perfume in the living room after she'd visited. One night, I knocked gently on his bedroom door, leaning against the frame as he looked up from his desk. "Hey," I said softly, "do you have a minute?" He nodded, putting down his pen. "Yeah, what's up?" I stepped inside and sat on the edge of his bed, smoothing the fabric of my sweatpants with my hands. "I wanted to talk to you about Emily." His eyebrows raised slightly, but he didn't seem uncomfortable. "Okay. I know she's important to you," I continued. "And I think it's great that you're experiencing this, relationships, figuring things out. But I also want to make sure you know how to handle it. Not just emotionally, but practically." He let out a small laugh, scratching the back of his neck. "Mom, are you seriously about to give me the talk? I already know about that stuff." I smiled, but I didn't let him off the hook. "I'm sure you do, but humor me. There's a difference between knowing the basics and knowing how to be responsible. I'm not just talking about protection. I'm talking about respect, boundaries, making sure you're both on the same page." His expression softened, and I could see the boy I used to hold in my arms, the one who'd ask endless questions about life and love when he was younger. "I get it," he said. "Really do. Emily and I talk about those things." "That's good," I replied, relieved. "Just remember you're both figuring this out. It's okay to make mistakes, but be honest with each other when you do." We sat in silence for a moment before he spoke again. "It's weird, isn't it? Me growing up." I nodded, my throat tightening. "It is. But I'm proud of you, Daniel. You've become someone I trust." He smiled, and that small moment, just the two of us, felt like a bridge between the past and the future. As the weeks passed, I noticed subtle changes in our dynamic. He started spending more weekends out of the house, coming home later and later. There were times when I'd sit in the living room with a book, listening for the sound of the front door opening and closing, relieved each time I heard his footsteps. One night, around 11 p.m., he came home smelling faintly of perfume and teenage cologne. I was in the kitchen, finishing up some work on my laptop, when he walked in. "Hey," I said, closing the screen. "Did you have a good night?" "Yeah," he replied, grabbing a glass of water. He leaned against the counter, looking more relaxed than usual. "Emily." He nodded, his eyes lighting up at the mention of her name. We went to the movies. I studied him for a moment, debating whether to ask the question on my mind. Finally, I took a breath and asked, "Do you ever feel overwhelmed?" He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "With relationships, intimacy, emotions. It's a lot to navigate." He hesitated, then nodded. "Sometimes. But Emily makes it easy. She's patient." That answer gave me comfort, but it also reminded me how young he still was. I couldn't protect him from everything, and maybe that was the hardest part of parenting, knowing when to step back. "Just promise me," I said, "if you ever feel like you're in over your head, you'll talk to me. Or someone you trust." "I promise," he said, and I believed him. One afternoon, as I was finishing up some charts for work, Daniel knocked on my bedroom door. "Can I ask you something?" he said, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. "Of course." He sat down on the edge of the bed, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "How do you know if you're in love?" I set aside my papers and gave him my full attention. "That's a hard question to answer," I admitted. "Love can feel different for everyone. Sometimes it's a warmth that stays with you long after the person leaves. Sometimes it's the way they make you feel understood." He nodded slowly, processing my words. "I think I might be," he said quietly. "In love, I mean." A lump formed in my throat, but I swallowed it down. "Then cherish it," I said softly. "But don't be afraid to question it. Love can be beautiful, but it can also be complicated." He smiled, and in that moment, I saw both the boy he used to be and the man he was becoming. As he left the room, I sat there, my heart full of pride and longing. My son was growing up, and though it was bittersweet, I knew that he was ready to face whatever came next. And I'd be here always, just in case he needed me. The kitchen smelled of vanilla and melted chocolate as I carefully smoothed the frosting over the cake's surface. Baking had always been therapeutic for me, a way to channel my energy and thoughts when they became too overwhelming. But today my mind wasn't just wandering, it was racing. Daniel's 18th birthday. My little boy was officially an adult, and I couldn't decide if I wanted to cry with pride or cling to him and beg him not to grow up any further. The cake in front of me was his favorite, rich chocolate layered with whipped cream and strawberries, the kind I used to make when he was a child and would sneak bites of frosting before I could finish decorating. The thought made me smile, but beneath the warmth of that memory was something else, something I had been trying to suppress for weeks. Jealousy. I hated admitting it, even to myself, but it had crept in quietly, like a shadow that I couldn't shake. I was jealous of Emily. Not in the sense that I wanted to take her place or ruin their relationship. No, it wasn't that simple. It was the way she had become such an important part of his life, the way his face lit up when he talked about her, the way he was slowly pulling away from me, even though I knew that was exactly what he was supposed to do. I had raised him for this moment, hadn't I? To be independent, to love, to build his own life. And yet, every time he mentioned her name, I felt a twinge of something sharp and unwelcome in my chest. I told myself it was normal, that every parent feels this way when their child begins to drift into adulthood. But it wasn't just the distance that bothered me, it was the fact that I liked having him close. I liked being the one he confided in, the one he needed. And lately, I had started to notice that I craved those moments of closeness more than I should. I shook my head, as if the motion could physically rid me of the thought. Well, I wouldn't let this feeling control me. Daniel deserved my support, not my selfish emotions. The sound of his footsteps on the stairs pulled me from my thoughts. I quickly finished decorating the cake and wiped my hands on a towel just as he entered the kitchen, his hair still damp from a shower. He looked so much like his father in that moment that it made my breath catch. Tall, broad-shouldered, with that same easy smile that could melt my heart. "Is that the cake?" he asked, grinning as he leaned over the counter to get a better look. "It is," I said, smiling back. "I was going to surprise you after dinner, but I guess you're too quick." He laughed, and the sound filled the room, warm and familiar. "You didn't have to go through all this trouble, Mom." "It's not trouble," I replied softly, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. "It's your birthday. You only turn 18 once. He stepped closer and wrapped his arms around me in a hug, and for a moment, I let myself sink into the warmth of him, inhaling the familiar scent of his shampoo mixed with something else, something new. The cologne I had given him that morning, the same scent his father used to wear. It was a small, sentimental gesture, and I wasn't even sure why I had chosen that particular cologne. Maybe it was a way of holding on to something that felt familiar, a way of tying the past to the present. "Thanks, Mom," he murmured, pulling back just enough to look at me. "You've always made my birthdays special." I smiled, my hands resting on his shoulders for a moment longer than necessary. "You make it easy." We stood there in silence for a moment, and I wondered if he could sense the emotions I was trying so hard to hide. But before I could dwell on it, he pulled away and reached for a strawberry from the top of the cake, popping it into his mouth with a grin. "Hey!" I scolded playfully, swatting at his hand. "That's for later." He laughed again and retreated, and I watched him go, my heart aching in a way that was both sweet and painful. That evening, after the guests had left and the house had settled into its usual quiet, Daniel came into the living room where I was folding laundry. He flopped onto the couch beside me, his legs stretched out lazily, and for a moment we sat there in comfortable silence. "Emily invited me to stay over tonight," he said suddenly, his voice soft but steady. I set down the shirt I was folding and turned to look at him. His expression was calm, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "And how do you feel about that?" I asked gently. "I'm excited, I guess," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But also nervous. I mean, I know we've talked about all this before, but now that it's actually happening, I don't know. I just don't want to mess things up." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The first time is always filled with that strange mix of anticipation and fear, the weight of expectations pressing down. "It's normal to feel that way," I said. "It's a big step, and it's okay to be unsure." He sighed, leaning his head back against the couch. "Do you have any advice? Practical tips, I guess." The vulnerability in his voice made my chest tighten, and I reached over to take his hand, squeezing it gently. "The most important thing," I began, "is communication. Don't assume you know what she wants or what she's comfortable with. Ask her. Make sure you're both on the same page." He nodded, his fingers tightening around mine. "Okay. That makes sense. And don't put too much pressure on yourself," I added. "It doesn't have to be perfect. What matters is that you're both comfortable and that you're both enjoying it. And if something doesn't go the way you expect, that's okay too." He smiled faintly. "You make it sound easy." "It's not always easy," I admitted. "But it's easier when you're with someone who cares about you. And from what I've seen, Emily cares about you a lot." He looked down at our intertwined hands, his thumb brushing lightly against my knuckles. "Thanks, Mom. I don't know what I'd do without you." My heart swelled, and for a moment I didn't trust myself to speak. Instead, I leaned over and kissed his forehead, the way I used to when he was a child. "You'll be fine," I whispered. "I promise." He stayed there for a while, leaning against me, and I let myself savor the closeness, knowing that moments like these would become rarer as he grew further into adulthood. But for now, he was still my son and I was still his mother. And that was enough. At least I told myself it was. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the faint rustle of fabric coming from Daniil's room upstairs. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. The rich, woodsy scent of the cologne I had given him earlier that day drifted through the house, winding its way into every corner like a subtle reminder of the significance of the evening. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply, letting the fragrance fill me, even though each breath stirred something restless within me. Daniil was getting ready for Emily. It was a strange feeling, knowing that my son, who had once needed my help tying his shoelaces and packing his school bag, was now preparing for a night that held the kind of anticipation and vulnerability that marked a new chapter in his life. He had asked me for advice earlier, seeking comfort and wisdom in the way only someone on the cusp of adulthood could. As proud as I was that he trusted me, That conversation had left me shaken. It wasn't just the words, the advice, or the significance of the moment. It was the realization that my role in his life was shifting faster than I was ready for. I heard his footsteps coming down the stairs, slow and steady. I looked up as he entered the room, and for a moment I couldn't speak. He looked incredible. His dark hair was combed back neatly. His button-up shirt hugged his broad shoulders just right, and the soft glow of the kitchen light highlighted the confidence he was slowly growing into. He had taken extra care with his appearance tonight. There was a bottle of wine in his hand, and his shoes, polished to perfection, clicked softly against the floor as he walked toward me. He caught me staring and smiled sheepishly. "Do I look okay?" I laughed softly, standing up from my chair. "Okay. You look amazing, Daniil. Emily's going to be thrilled." My voice was steady, but inside, a wave of emotions swirled. Pride, nostalgia, and something I couldn't quite name. He placed the bottle of wine on the counter and adjusted the cuffs of his shirt. "I just don't want to mess things up, you know?" "You won't," I said, reaching out to touch his arm briefly. "You're thoughtful and kind. That's all anyone could ask for." He nodded, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. "Thanks for helping me earlier." "Mean it. I don't think I'd be this calm if we hadn't talked." His words hit me harder than I expected, and before I could second-guess myself, I pulled him into a hug. His arms wrapped around me, warm and familiar, and I felt a lump form in my throat. This was my son, the boy who used to fall asleep in my lap during thunderstorms, who once cried because he thought he'd heard a butterfly by accident. And now he was standing here as a young man, on the brink of love, life, and everything in between. I held on for just a second longer than necessary, then stepped back, giving him a smile that I hoped masked the storm brewing inside me. "You're going to be fine, Daniil. Just be yourself." He picked up the wine, slinging his jacket over his shoulder, and started toward the door. Just before he left, he turned around and kissed me lightly on the cheek. "Good night, Mum. I'll see you tomorrow." "Good luck," I whispered, watching as the door closed behind him. And then I was alone. I stood by the door for a moment, listening to the sound of his car engine fading down the street. The house felt too quiet now, like the silence was mocking me. The smell of his cologne lingered, wrapping itself around me in an almost tangible embrace, and I found myself sitting back down at the kitchen table, unable to shake the storm of feelings crashing through me. This was supposed to be a happy moment. I had raised him to be responsible, compassionate, and confident. I had spent years preparing him for nights like this, for experiences that would shape him into the man he was meant to be. So why did I feel like I was being left behind? I rested my head in my hands, breathing deeply to steady myself. This wasn't just about Daniil and Emily. This was about the fact that my life had become a quiet, predictable rhythm since the divorce. I had poured so much of myself into raising him after his father and I split, balancing work, parenting, and everything in between, that I hadn't stopped to think about what I would do once he didn't need me as much. Now the house felt too big, and the silence pressed against me like a weight. Memories of the past flashed through my mind. Daniil as a toddler, clinging to my leg when I dropped him off at preschool. Daniil at 10 years old, proudly showing me the certificate he'd earned in a spelling bee. Daniil at 14, awkward and quiet after the divorce, but always trying to be brave. I had been there for all of it. Every scraped knee, every late-night homework crisis, every whispered confession about his fears. But tonight he was creating a memory that didn't involve me, and that thought made my chest ache. I stood up abruptly, needing to move, to do something, anything to distract myself. I walked into the living room and picked up a book from the coffee table, but after reading the same sentence 3 times without comprehending it, I set it down. I tried turning on the television, flipping aimlessly through channels, but nothing held my attention. Finally, I gave in to the restless energy and grabbed a blanket, wrapping it around my shoulders as I stepped out onto the back porch. The cool night air brushed against my skin, and the sound of crickets filled the space around me. I sat on the porch swing, swaying gently as I stared up at the stars. What was this feeling? Was it jealousy? Longing? Or was it simply the weight of change, of knowing that time was moving forward whether I was ready or not. Maybe it was all of those things. Maybe it didn't matter. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, letting the crisp night air fill my lungs. Daniil was growing up, and I couldn't hold him back, no matter how much I wanted to freeze this moment in time. He was going to experience love, heartbreak, and all the messy, beautiful parts of life. And I would be here, cheering him on from a distance, even when it hurt. Because that's what mothers do. When I finally went back inside, the house still smelled faintly of his cologne. But this time, instead of feeling overwhelmed by it, I let it comfort me. It was a reminder that he wasn't gone. He was just living his life, and that was exactly what he was supposed to do. I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, my heart still heavy but a little more at peace. Daniil would come back in the morning, and when he did, I would be here, ready to listen to his stories and give him all the advice he needed. And maybe, just maybe, I'd start thinking about what was next for me too.